Wittgenstein wrote in the preface to his investigations that he never found a satisfying order for his later thoughts because they were interconnected in complex ways, like many sketches of landscapes from different perspectives, composed over long wandering journeys. So this following talk is my attempt to weave Wittgenstein's thoughts in the philosophical investigations together to put the ideas in a more teachable sequence. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus said that all is in flux and thus we cannot step in the same river twice, and Wittgenstein actually quoted these two different thoughts without mentioning Heraclitus either time in different notes. And Wittgenstein wrote that if we want to understand life, we must learn to feel at home in primeval chaos. Our world and ways of life in it continuously change, ever so slightly, but continuously, and so our lives are full of doubts and uncertainties. The bustle of life is not exactly regular, repeating itself often, but not entirely, and neither are the ways we speak and think about it. Uncertainty is at the roots of life and every deep philosophical question. Wittgenstein said that this difficult point, that uncertainty and variability is at the roots of everything deep in life and philosophical, is perhaps the best place to begin our philosophical investigations. Would we want to exchange our unpredictable lives of uncertainty for predictable lives of absolute certainty? Would we want to know the future? Would we want to know what others feel and think with complete certainty, eliminating the possibility of lies, games, and mysteries? There's no games in which I don't know what the next chess move is. Imagine if we all watched brilliant computers play a calculated game of chess in which we already knew who the winner was going to be because they told us, now let's watch the moves. It is not clear that we would trade our lives in for certainty, as living in a certainty would be quite unfamiliar. It is clear we would not trade our lives in for complete chaos. Thankfully, there are things that remain somewhat the same that we grow to trust as familiar. Familiar people, such as parents, family, friends, and teachers and authorities. Familiar objects, such as food, toys, tools, and furniture. And familiar places, such as homes, school, parks, stores, streets, roads, and trails. If you walked into a strange dimension each time you did anything, we could not have brains the way we have them. So we absorb the ways of each of these things as we familiarize with them growing up. And we watch things get broken into smaller, simpler parts or included in larger, complex groups, depending on how they are used. Just as we are not taught to play chess in our minds without a board and pieces, but we could. Meaning is not privately inside our minds. Rather, it is in shared public practices, in familiar circumstances where we have learned how to do things like others, or slightly unlike others. Meaning isn't a mental activity any more than a rise in butter prices is an independent act of butter. It doesn't put any of this on purely objective footing, as in now we know the absolute truth. But in the interweaving of things competently or incompetently, that is what truth and meaning is. Most of the time, in familiar everyday cases, we easily understand and use words. But the stranger the case, the less clear it is what to say or how what is said should be used. If all cases were abnormal, the ways we use words would not work. We'd have different brains. We'd be different creatures if the world was just sliding all around on us. Just as if lumps of cheese unpredictably change size and weight, pricing cheese would be useless. So we come to feel familiar with many ways of doing things, just as we feel with old friends. But ways that are different feel unfamiliar, strange, and odd. So we learn to trust ourselves and others, and even objects and places, but not completely. We misunderstand and are misunderstood, creating problems that require interaction and negotiation. Much of the time we trust the familiar without thinking, sitting in a chair that happens to collapse, and other times we trust with too much thinking, reasoning away what we hope isn't true. Regardless, trusting as we do in situations that are always somewhat unknown and unfamiliar, but always somewhat familiar, is the background and backdrop of all the ways we speak and think about what is and isn't. Without all of this, it would be very difficult to do anything at all. Wittgenstein remarked that if he looked out his window and saw a strange, unfamiliar world, that he would suppose he'd gone mad. Trust is so central to truth and meaning, thus, to grounding the ways of our lives, that if we found ourselves in an unfamiliar world, we would doubt our own senses and reasoning and sanity and minds, the most trustworthy and reliable sources of experience and evidence we have. Groucho Marx says, who are you going to trust, me or your own eyes? Much of Wittgenstein's thought is focused on the many ways we use language, which is why the investigation opens with a quote from Augustine rather than Heraclitus. Wittgenstein says we can imagine a language that works like a chest of drawers. We teach young children language by directing their attentions to things and saying words to help them form associations, and things which have been associated together increasingly feel as if they fit and belong in particular situations. As we learn language, we may or may not have images in mind when using words because of these associations, but words are not simply used to bring images into our heads. or bring objects into the room. We do not need to imagine an apple whenever we use the word apple. And the word can be used to identify actual apples just as much as evoke imaginary ones. Why don't we have a different word for imaginary apples or two apples? Consider that children learn to use words such as this and that, but we cannot point to what this and that are in themselves, as they are used to refer to many different things. But children learn to use these words by watching others use them, associating the act of pointing to or talking about things with the words. Just as a brake lever in a train cabin brakes the train in conjunction with the rest of the machine, if you took the brake lever out of the train and you put it on a microscope stand and you examined it, you would not understand how braking a train works. The meaning of what we say is not found in words alone, but in the entire situation of using them. The meaning of a word is overall the way it is used, just as a toolbox holds many different tools: hammers, pliers, saw, screwdriver, ruler, glue, nails, screws, and other useful things, and they don't all have to perfectly fit together. If I said, prove to me that a hammer and pliers is sufficient for every task, you'd look at me like I was weird. So similarly, languages have many different types of words that are used in many ways, not just it calling for a rock or a worm. Similarly, a train cabin has a crank which is moved in circles, a switch that can be on or off, and a brake which is intensified with greater pressure, and they don't all have to work like switches or brake mechanisms or pulleys. We mistakenly think that words are used in one way, like a simple set of drawers. When we think and talk about speaking and thinking philosophically, abstracting language and logic from particular complex situations, logical positivism, formal logic, Russell in his earlier work misunderstood the foundations of things in just this way. We can see language best in the situations where it lives and works, not when it is on abstract vacation. Wittgenstein says when language goes on holiday, we could group tools together by the type of job they do, by the combination in which we use them, by when they are available, by weight, by color, or countless other ways depending on whatever purposes we have and situations we find ourselves in. In a game of chess, we might group pieces into ours and theirs, pieces that are more or less valuable, pieces that can move more or less spaces, or pieces that can jump over others, depending on the situation. Using these classifications in various combinations depending on the game you're in, which moves we want to make, and which moves we want to avoid, which can change in unpredictable ways in a single game. We could say that the languages we use are all incomplete, as they do not yet contain all of the words and ways to use them that we need for all our possible and future purposes. Our languages, like old cities, and they are just as complete now as they were before the suburbs of modern chemistry and infinitesimal calculus grew around them.